let's discuss something that I left out in my previous video. So, what we're looking at here is the Powerhouse Museum. This Powerhouse Museum houses a lot of scientific and artistic artifacts. The word MAAS, which is written quite cool, and the building looks pretty awesome in my opinion, means the Museum of Arts and Science. So, what is inside this museum that we need to look at? By the way, it's in Sydney, Australia. So, exactly what is inside this that makes it so interesting? Well, this is the building that houses these interesting artifacts. Now, of course, we can see that these coins have writing on them, and some of them are scratched out, and some of them are written. So, where exactly do they come from? Well, like I said last time, they are from Kilwa. But how do we know? How could we possibly know that these coins come exactly from Kilwa when we look at maps that were made by Muslims from back in the day, or some maps that were made by Europeans inspired by Muslims at the very time that this would have happened, about 1100s? We don't see any real description of Australia. Australia seems to be completely away from the map. So, how can we then prove that these coins are from a civilization that was connected to a wider sea range that had nothing to do with maps that could involve Australia? So, a couple things that we'll have to go into. But first, let's talk about this map right here. As you can see, most of Africa is not in range. These people were fully unaware of most of Africa, but we still see some Islamic coins that are found in deep Africa. In fact, speaking about Kilwa, we have recently found a large amount of coins from Kilwa in the sub Saharan African region about the same time. By the will of some god or some cosmic entity or the universe, we have found a treasure of Kilwin coins that are comparable to the ones that we find in Australia. So, where were these ones found? Well, these ones are found in Tanzania. As with coins everywhere in the world, they have identifying markers, and these markers tell us exactly what time and date they were. We'll come back to when these ones are, but let's first discuss exactly what we're looking at here. So we're looking at 300 coins that were discovered in Tanzania. They are from the Kilwan region, dated a long time ago. Their color is a little off because they are obviously found in the ground and they have decayed a little bit, but luckily there's enough of it so that it can be recognized. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, it is believed that the Tanzanians in the past were not interested in money, but instead were trading in goods. But as you can see here, they clearly were interested in money and they were part of a giant network of traders. People, including myself, said that they use shells for trading, and this is absolutely true. But just like a lingua franca, they needed a form of money that they could trade back and forth with the rest of the world that would be respected by the world, and not just a piece of money that would be used by themselves only. So, again, this addresses one issue. It still doesn't address why Australia isn't on the map, but we're getting there. The second thing that we have to look at are the beads at the bottom. The beads at the bottom also tell us of a completely different story than the one that we know. And of course, we have evidence going back, a couple hundred years that also show us that these beads and other places in the world had complete contact with one another, especially Kilwa, which is so close to Yemen and so close to these other places. Now, I don't want to make the mistake that I did last time by not showing you exactly where Kilwa is, so let's start there. So Kilwa is located over there on the east side of Africa, very close to the Horn. But I want us to look at the map that they created, and as you can see in that map, that it feels a little inaccurate. As accurate as this map is, it feels a little inaccurate. Like if you look at, let's guide our eyes to Egypt. So using the accurate one, look at Egypt. If you go down, you'll realize that there's an underestimation of how big Yemen is, and therefore the Horn is underestimated. And if you keep going down, you eventually get to Kilwa, but the Horn was so underestimated that you can get to Kilwa without moving over the Horn. So this is the mistake that they made back in the day, because if something is easy to get around, they assume that it's not as large as it is, but we can tell now that the Horn of Africa is pretty large. In fact, it's actually very, very large. And this is one of the problems with Africa, because people underestimate its size. So let's get back to these beads. What are these beads that we are looking at, these red beads? Well, what we're looking at is carnelian beads, from the site. And these carnelian beads are unique to other beads that would make their way all the way to Africa, sort of gloss beads made by Muslims or Arabs, gloss beads made by Europeans that would make their way down there as early as the 1100s. These days people talk about, gloss beads being made that landed in the 1700s, but in real life, even in South Africa, we find out that gloss beads that were traded throughout this network made it all the way to South Africa as early as the 12th, 13th century, which would mean that these people were in a giant network, which for the Arabs, they stopped sort of at Kilwa, but for the Africans themselves, it stopped maybe at the Cape of Good Hope. Remember, when we say that the Arabs hadn't discovered the Cape of Good Hope, the Europeans hadn't discovered it, or anybody else, we must remember that those people are aliens to the land of Africa. The natives of Africa were fully aware of the Cape of Good Hope. They were fully aware of, any other place in Africa that is close to their proximity, and some of them were aware of the entire continent. People who were living in West Africa. Now, because they didn't tell anybody, that doesn't mean that well, they did tell some people, but because they didn't tell anybody so that they could steal their trade networks, doesn't mean that they didn't know about them. And in fact, we do know about that they know about them, because we find things from Nigeria all the way down to the most southerly parts. We find even when the Portuguese come down there, they're like, oh, there's Moors coming from West Africa, and they're landing in Tanzania, in those regions. So some Moors were moving from the middle of West Africa all the way down, but they were not telling anybody else about this history. So again, those beads, where do they come from? Well, they're made in India, or at least that's what the historians think. Let's first talk about carnelian before we read exactly why they think they come from India. But carnelian beads have been found from about 4000 BC all over the world. Bulgaria is one area, the Maghreb. They've been also found in the Levant. They've also been found in Crete, in Knossos, that's in Europe. They've also been found in India, of course, and they've been found in other parts of Africa. So these beads don't necessarily show that they are unique to India, but they have their own reasons for believing why these ones came directly from India. So we read, the Indian artisans and traders were likely responsible for the carnelian bead found in C300 test pit mentioned above. This bead is similar to others found in Swahili centers such as Songo Mnara and Kilwa, both in Tanzania consider carnelian beads as either imported from India or locally made by Indian artisans due to the complex diamond tip drilling technique involved in the production. So, of course, you can see here that the real reason why they believe it is not because carnelian beads are unique to the Indian areas, but instead the technology of putting diamonds at the tip of a drill and then drilling through that way. And it's possible. And it's actually more likely. Now, there's a reason why they say Indians in Kilwa. Because remember, I've made many videos about this, is because there were Indians who would move from India to Africa to get ahead of the trade, right? And they would just stay there. And remember, at the time of Vasco da Gama, when he went to India, he actually talked to some Indian merchants, and they remember there were the Christian Indian merchants that started firing their bombards or firing their cannons in the air in support of seeing another Christian on this side of the Swahili, which of course would be impossible a time earlier, as the people of Swahili are mainly Muslims and other religions, native African religions, which is an important video we need to talk about the fact that a lot of the people living in the Swahili coast would have participated with this religion in mind. Their entire mindset, their entire life, their reality was within the mindset of an African religion, not Islam, which some people pretend that the entire Swahili coast was Islamic, but it's not true. So again, we can see here carnelian beads that are being used by Indians. Indians are part of this giant Kilwin trade, but not only are they part of the Kilwin trade, they're part of the entire trade of the Swahili coast, and they land in those areas and trade clothing, trade beads, trade gold in these areas. Boats are seen in their thousands just on the shores of Africa by Portuguese merchants. It's pretty obvious that Indians were always in that region. So that's a mistake that I made last time in my video, where I made it sound like, oh yeah, the Kilwins could have known and they might have known, but we're talking about an actual like thing where everybody knows how to get to India and everybody knows how to get back from India to Africa. And remember, we have a population of people who, from the earliest days, and they were not all slaves, from the earliest days, they all made their way into India, and they're called the Siddhis. And at first, the largest population of these Siddhis, the people of India, black people of India, the majority of them used to be Habesha, meaning that they were of the Ethiopian Somali type, but then later they were Sidis or Zanj populations, so Bantu populations that made it to those regions. This fact would be interesting for several reasons. One of them is, of course, we see this civilization growing. So every time Africans are brought to India, to the places where the cities are, and remember, some fortresses are actually later, so they don't get brought to that fortress. But every time we see them, this population grows, which means that there is an enclave or there's a small area where these people, the more Africans keep coming, they keep going to this exact location. Of course, not to mention that there were some Middle Eastern styled African eunuchs who took over some parts of India, but that's not what this is about. So these people who would be located in this region, who their population has now been established by this time, they also had a port where other people of black African origin would come and stay there and create a mass population, giving them an easy route to places like Indonesia, which were discovered by Indians, or at least they were populated first by native Asians in those regions. And then the Indians came over and basically created an empire in that region, and the only time it was really in trouble of being eradicated by a foreign power was Genghis Khan's people, or the Mongols, who came down. It was really Kublai Khan, but the Mongols who came down to try and fight the Indonesians in those places. These are the people of Indonesia, and as you can see, they are very diverse. Not quite Asian, not quite Polynesian, not quite Middle Eastern, and not quite Indian, but something approximating in the middle. And you can see that they have a saying that they created because of this diversity, which of course is seen within their religion and within their culture. The saying, of course, is unity in diversity, or in their language, Bineka Tungalika, and it means unity through diversity. Now, this is a reality that had to exist in this region because, of course, of so many people who come from so many different parts and contributed to the history of this place. Now, it's not just that they contributed to the history of this place, but this place became an interesting area of trade. And this is where the Kilwa coins start to get a little more interesting than just being a bunch of coins. We can see from the earliest days a type of writing that is called Malay writing, and this Malay writing is highly influenced by the cultures that surround the area. One of the cultures that surround the area are the Indians, and the Indians contributed heavily to the literature of this area. Of course, because they were Indians, two religions start to make their way down here. That's Buddhism and Hinduism. That's good. So, what about the third religion that eventually comes? Well, remember that is Islam. And so those coins that were made far away, the Kiln coins, could have been seen as valuable by these people and the fact that they are from Africa. But is there any connection between Africa and the languages spoken in Indonesia? Well, the answer is obviously yes. And this can be seen from the island of Madagascar, which is known to these people, the Polynesian style Malagasy people, who, as you can see in their language family, the language that they brought to this region, which, by the way, we know that this region traded heavily with the Indonesian people, even though we see no writing from these people. We know their language, but we don't see any writing, which sort of leads us to believe that a lot of the people who moved to these areas were traders, not necessarily intellectuals in the sense of writing. So you can see here the family that this language belongs to: Austronesian, Malayo, Polynesian, Western Indonesian, Burrito, East Burrito, Malagasy. And so, obviously, with this, we can tell that in Africa, also the Comoros Islands also have this as well. This means in East Africa, at least some people, some black people, black African Zanj people, could speak a language from Australia back in the day. How did this happen? Well, it's because the Malagasy people mated and fused with the cultures of the Bantu people who landed about the same time in Madagascar. What we are looking here is a in red, and in red in Madagascar, we can see the trade route between Madagascar and the Swahili coast. This trade route, though it has nothing to do with the people of the Arabian regions, was also facilitated by Arabs. How do we know? Well, one of the mistakes that we make is that we try to look at writing in the form of natives or something like that, when in real life writing doesn't matter who, it doesn't matter who invented it. It just exists. And we find that the writing system that sort of conjoins the Kilwin areas, and it joins with the Madagascan areas, is Arabic. And Here, they could have traded easily within these areas. We find coins, obviously, from Kilwa from the 11th century, and we find other documents from the 9th century and the 10th century in Madagascar as well. Now, both of these places were known earlier than this to the Arabs, but this is when they first had a real contact. Remember, Kilwa was became sort of Muslim in the 8th, 9th century. This means that you have Africans who could probably somewhat communicate with the people of Indonesia fairly well, and they were aware of who the people were. And like I said, the Madagascans would sail away and land in the Indonesian areas, and the trade would start there. And this is how, of course, these coins would have made their way all the way to Madagascar, as you can see there. From, by the way, this is from a study. It's not something that I just pulled off of the internet. You can see there that you can, from the red in the southern Bantu regions, there's trade with the Madagascans. From the Madagascans, you have Austronesians in Borneo who trade with the people of Madagascar. And we have this back and forth that happens for years and years and years and years and years and years and years after that. And there's plenty of time for the Kilwin thing to reach that area. Remember, they're all from the 1100s, which is very interesting, which brings me to my final point. How do we know that they're from the 1100s? How do we know that they're Kilwin? How do we know any of that? Well, of course, the materials they made of bronze and copper, and that was the type that was made there. They have their own unique weight, which has been scanned and weighed, and that's one of them. But that's not the most important part. The most important part is what's written on the coins. So on these coins, there's actually two important pieces of information. One is Ali ibn al-Hassan. Now, what the hell is Ali ibn al-Hassan? Well, Ali ibn al-Hassan is the founder of the Kilwin civilization, so to speak. Well, in it's been mythologized that he had purchased a piece of the Kilwin civilization from a Bantu, and he was allowed to create certain things in those regions. He married local women, and he continued the culture of this area, this very small area. And Kilwa is a huge thing. Now, you can remember that this conflicts with Al Masudi, who said Muslims took over this region. So if Al Masudi is saying something different, we already have a problem of purchase versus takeover. Al ibn Hassan is not very strongly historically written about, but these coins show direct evidence that he must have existed and he must have been respected within these areas. Of course, we have Ibn Battuta who talks about how the people in that area are jet black and they still wear the scars, which means the culture was not destroyed, but these people were converted into Islam. And I'll tell you why. Well, when we look at these coins, what else is written on them? The famous Muslim phrase, La ilaha illa Allah, which means no one is worth praise or worship besides Allah, which roughly, if you translate it in a non direct way in English, would be there is no God but Allah. And this is what we're actually dealing with in that area. So we have a Kilwan name, which is early in the history and would be erased in later coins, replaced by newer names of people. And then we have the Muslim phrase, there is no God but Allah, which tells us that these people who must have sent these to this area were Muslims, which we can see Muslims being attested for as far as Indonesia at the same time, and of course, unity and diversity. So we're talking about an area that had Islam probably Christianity at some point, but we're not sure when Christianity first got to that region. But Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so many other religions from that region. And of course, they sort of unified to other religions, Islam being one of the biggest at one time. And also, we see that the people of China, the people of the Mongolian regions, they came in, looked at them, wrote about them, and we see their writings or their history that was relayed to the European Marco Polo. And Marco Polo gives us a clue about what these people believed and who they were, which is great, but it still doesn't answer the question. It still doesn't answer the question of how then does it go from there to Australia? Okay, let's just say the Indonesians took it there. Well, why didn't they take any other coin to that specific region? Why are there not coins of Arabic writing from the Middle East? Why are there no coins from India? Why are there no Arabic coins from anywhere really? Why are there no coins from Indonesia? Why are we looking at Kilwan directly? This is a mystery that will probably be solved another day, but obviously there's something fairly unique going on. What if, as I said, the people of Kilwa could communicate with the people of Madagascar, and the people of Madagascar and Kilwa, who united together and traveled to Indonesia, what if they were able to communicate with the people of Indonesia, and through this communication, they were able to talk about exactly what's going on outside of the Indonesian regions, and sailors told them that there is another land that everybody doesn't know about, and perhaps because the people of Madagascar are the same as the people of Indonesia, they might have been more trusted than the people of India or the Middle East or Africa, and they were given the ability, the thought, the right to go and investigate in the Australian regions, told by the Indonesians, who would have told them about the secret land, which, by the way, no one wrote about ever in history until Australia was discovered later. So you look at Australia and it's not written about. You see Kilwin coins over there, no other, probably due to the fact that the Kilwins had some kind of up on everybody else, which, by the way, Kilwa is probably one of the least represented historically when it comes to the Silk Road. But if it's one of the least represented, and we have accurate information housed in real museums, dated, tested, and the people who tried to debunk it, they got debunked instantly. And in fact, the Kilwins find themselves in this situation where their history is probably more well locked in five coins of travel than any other place in history, because of so much speculation about what they did. And probably, because one of the things that people say is the Indians came to them rather than them going to the Indians, or the Muslims came to them rather than them going to the Muslims. But of course, this doesn't make any sense because we have writings from people like Al Masudi who talks about how these people ventured out. But forget any of that. What we're talking about is a true maritime trade, a true swing. And also, I want to throw something away that I said one time, which was, oh, they used African boats. Remember that these people had contact with Muslims, and they had contact with Indonesians, and they had contact with Madagascans. And so their boats would have developed in the same level, where they would start off with some pretty basic African boats, but this would transform fairly quickly once they ran into other people. As you can see, their entire civilization also transformed when they ran into the other people. When Ibn Battuta ran into them, right? He said that they have scars on their faces and all of that. And I hope I'm not repeating this in this video, but I have to say it because it's important to say this. When he ran into them, remember, this is way later, way later, after the transformation to Islam in this specific region. The transformation to Islam did not take away any of the scarification on the face. And this is important because it does show that the culture continued, but it does show that these people continued but didn't choose to be ignorant. They didn't choose to ignore the technologies that would come afterwards, which would, it throws a huge rock in the idea that these people were stagnant and up until the 1700s they were doing the same exact things. No, they weren't. They were doing everything that everybody else was doing. And of course we have them being written about by the Romans, the Greeks, the everybody, Turks. And in fact, remember what I said before, when Vasco da Gama was trying to land in Southeast Africa. When he got there, he found Muslims. And these Muslims were so aware of the world that when they saw him, they didn't assume him to be Christian. They assumed him to be a Turk. That's how aware these people were of the world. They assumed him to be a Muslim Turk. They didn't assume he was an Arab Muslim. I'm gonna fix that. An Arab Muslim because he was so pale in color. They just assumed that he was a Turk, and they pretended to be Turks. And of course, they were traveling with a few people who could speak the Turkic language, which helped. They were traveling with a bunch of people who could speak different languages. One of them was from the Kingdom of Congo. This would be probably one of the first non African based travel from the Kingdom of Congo. So they traveled with two people from the Kingdom of Congo, a black guy and a white guy. The white guy who learned the language from the Kingdom of Congo, who landed in the region where the Muslims were, and he realized that he could communicate with the people of this region, meaning that these people were still speaking their language first over Arabic because they didn't use Arabic. They knew Arabic, but they didn't use Arabic to communicate with these people. They used the Bantu language. So, in conclusion, what am I saying? I'm saying that we're playing a game here that is bigger and more dangerous in its historical significance than we think. We are looking at this as if it's not as important as the pyramids or anything like that, but in real life, I mean, there's a reason why all those articles were saying it what might overturn history. We're talking about the ability for these people to have gone to Indonesia and then proof that these people went to Australia. Now, what's so unique about those Australian islands? Well, the thing that's unique about it is that look at the island that's right there. So we can see Australia. Let me zoom in a little bit. You can see there, that's Australia. And then right next to it, there's Papua New Guinea. And then right next to it, you can see there's Indonesia. So if you look over there, you can see that there's a movement from there to the Wessel Islands, which are the ones highlighted in red, where these Kilwin coins were found. And the distance from there to Papua New Guinea is very short compared to going to Indonesia. Okay, so what? Well, from Papua New Guinea, you see islands that were used by the people who were Polynesian, and those people traveled to, guess what? The Americas at about the same time. So if we look at this map, we can see that there is a definite movement between the people of Australia to Papua New Guinea, people of Papua New Guinea to the Polynesian regions. And of course, it was the Polynesians, not the Papua New Guineans or the Melanesians, as they are called, who traveled to the Americas, at least not in mass. And these Polynesians who traveled all the way, and you can see the Easter Island probably being the furthest one, and we know that obviously Easter Island had the the pure travel from these people. But also think about it, Easter Island is also a standout on itself. Like all of a sudden, you have rocks, you have writing, you have all these things that are located in that region. If you can see on this map, you can see that there's Fiji, which is the connector between the Polynesians and the Melanesians, who would all of these people are sort of boat people. In other words, they travel from one place to another, sort of the nomadic lifestyle that is there, but obviously over boat, not over land. And this is backed up by a lot of evidence. As you can see, Polynesians that were later discovered as far as Easter Island and there's other places, even those who would later be in the Americas, they had Austronesian DNA. Now, if you don't know what an Austronesian is, an Austronesian is somebody who is from Australia, New Guinea, Indonesia, Madagascar, that type of DNA we find inside of some of the Polynesians, proving that there is a connection between these people. In fact, that connection goes back to a particular date, the 9th century. For brevity, we'll use Wikipedia, and as you can see there, Tonga and Samoa, a cultural divide began to develop between Fiji to the west and the distinctive Polynesian language and cultural emerging on Tonga and Samoa to the east, where there was once faint evidence of uniquely shared developments in Fijian and Polynesian speech. Most of this is now called borrowing and is thought to have occurred in those and later years more than as a result of continuing unity of their earliest dialects on those far-flung lands. Contacts were mediated especially through the Tavota Confederacy of Fiji. This is where most Fijian Polynesian linguists' interactions occurred. In the chronology of the exploration and first populating of Polynesia, there is a gap commonly referred to as the long pause between the first populating of Fiji, Western Polynesia, of Tonga and Samoa, among others, and the settlements of the rest of the region. In general, this gap is considered to have lasted roughly 1,000 years. The cause of the gap in voyaging is continuous among archaeologists, with a number of competing theories presented, including climate shifts, the need for development of a new voyaging techniques, and cultural shifts. After the long pause, dispersion of populations into central and eastern Polynesia began, although the exact timing of when each island group was settled is debated. It is widely accepted that the island group in the geographic center of the region, the Cook Islands, Society Islands, Marquesas Islands, were settled initially between 1000 and 1150 AD and ending with more far-flung island groups such as Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island settled between 1200 and 1300 AD. So of course we have to break this whole down. We can see there that we are talking about the 10 to 1100s, which of course is when the people of Africa landed in that near Australian island, and you can see that the areas, including the Fijian movement within the Papua New Guinea areas, would have had some Polynesian influences and stuff that came from the Fijians all the way to this region. Now, what is important about this is that at this time, we see that the Polynesians have had back migration, or let's say trade, with the Americas. And from the Americas at this time, we could find sweet potatoes that have been moved from the Americas into the Polynesian regions, and from the Polynesian regions moved into the New Guinea regions. So we see a huge travel from this area. And so the people of New Guinea, at least some of them, might have had a connection with the Americas. And if the people of Africa were somewhat curious, they could have possibly asked or even known about the travels of these people. Now, I don't think that happened, but clearly this joins two long trade routes. Now, Chris Hugh Ballard talks about this in a more detailed way, and also, I think, confirms that the people of New Guinea must have had some real movement within the Polynesians of America, at least trade with the Polynesians who went to the Americas. So, as we read here, Polynesians in America, pre Columbian contacts in the New World. Now, before I start reading, I want to first state again that we're not talking about speculation. We're not talking about something that people think happened. We're talking about things that actually happened in real life, that the Polynesians went to America. So let's read. This volume marks the latest revival of a 150-year-old debate on the timing, nature, and scope of the Trans-Pacific contacts prior to the European expansion. Early 19th century speculation on the possibility of the connections between the Americas and the Pacific island was given more substance from the 1860s, when the apparent similarity between the Quechua term for sweet potato, kumar, and the Polynesian Kumara was first noted and attributed to human transfer. Despite the longevity of the debate, there are still precious few unequivocal proofs of the trans-Pacific contact, and most of these remain ambivalent in terms of the light they shed on questions of agency or the direction of movement. Of these proofs, perhaps the most significant has been the discovery of charred sweet potato in Mangaya in the Cook Islands, dated long before contact with the European contact with the Americas. Generally, transfers of people, ideas, and material in either direction do not appear to have been substantial and were almost certainly outweighed by their impacts. Yet significant questions hang on the resolution of these issues, ranging from the specifics of cultural historical reconstruction in the Pacific and Americas through to more general understandings of the process of intercultural contact and exchange. And the pace of adoption of the novel crops and artifacts was sweet potato, which entirely transformed the New Guinea highlands, available for adoption 1,000 years ago through Polynesian transfer, or 700 years later through European transport to island Southeast Asia. How might we reevaluate the sailing capacities of South America and Polynesians, were we able to demonstrate that either one or the other was responsible for trans-Pacific voyaging? Their choice of the title alone indicates that the editors of Polynesians in America have nailed their colors firmly to the mast, focusing on the Polynesians and not Americans or Asians as the agents of the contact and transfer. Now, interestingly, he brings up a couple good points. One of them, of course, he brings up the Quechua, which he says, and a lot of people say, that the name of the potato and the name of the potato in the Polynesian areas have the same name. But first, let's look at the areas that are considered Quechuan historical lands. So you can see there the Quechuans are located in South America in these regions. Now, who exactly are these Quechuans? Well, obviously, Quechuans have kind of suffered a little bit due to the historical movement of Europeans into South America, but they represent a large group of Amerindians who have lived forever in these regions. So let's take a look at them and then we'll come back to this map. These are the Quechuans, and these are the Quechuans using potatoes, which is a great image. these Quechens who are Native American and they lived in a completely different way than other people in those regions, they represent something fairly important, especially that person brings up, which is we don't know who initiated the movement between the Polynesians and the Americans. I mean, we assume that it was the Polynesians, which is why it's called the Polynesian movement, but it could be the other way around where some American Quechan type people moved to the area. And one of the proofs that he gives for this is actually a very important one. The proof that he gives is the fact that the name of the potato is still the same, and it's obviously probably due to transfer from one side to the other. I mean, they could have called it anything once they brought it back, but the fact that the name is the same also gives us an indicator that they brought it there. And when people ask, "What is this?" you give it a name. Okay, this is what it is. This is very important because, of course, it would be only in like the 15th or 16th century after the Americans had arrived in America that almost anybody else in the world would be aware of these potatoes or even use names similar to it. Now, one of the things that he's alleging is that it could have been Southeast Asians who traveled there rather than Polynesians, and then they brought it back down to these regions. But, that's very hard to believe when you consider the fact that Polynesians had traveled to the greatest extent that they could. And, I mean, we're talking about really close to the Americas. So, do I believe it was actually Polynesians who went to the Americas? Yes, I do. I don't think it was the Americans who went to them. Do I think once the Americans were aware that you could go there, that they went there? Absolutely, I do. That believe that the Americans did go there. I think that if the books of the Americas weren't burned the way they were by the Portuguese and Spanish, there's probably some important information that would have been in there. But this brings me to that Indonesian chart that Albuquerque talked about. So remember, Albuquerque talked about a chart that was found in Indonesia that showed a lot of areas of the world, including the Americas. Now, obviously, we know that the Americas were discovered then in the 15th century by some Europeans. Discovered is probably not the best word. They were traveled to that place for the first time in European history. Eh, not even there because, of course, you have the Vikings. But the point is, after that, we see as early as the 16th century a Javanese map, Indonesia as we'll call it, but a Javanese map, Java, not Japanese, but Javanese map that we see depicting Afonso de Albuquerque's contact with a man who is writing about or has a chart that speaks about the Americas in a early contact between the Javanese and the Americans. Now, what's important about this is that if we take everything we already know, so we know the history of America having contact with Polynesia, Polynesia having contact with Melanesia, Melanesia having contact with Indonesia, there is no need for them to not know that they are the Americas. But if you take that into mind, could they have, at the time, if they had known about Indonesia, told this to anybody else outside this region, especially since the first European who got there, that's what he saw immediately. On the side, we have the original written in the language of Albuquerque, and then let's read the translation, which shows exactly what he said. A piece of a chart taken from a large chart of a Javanese pilot containing the Cape of Good Hope, Africa. Remember that? The Cape of Good Hope is in Africa, Portugal, and the land of Brazil, important parts here. Portugal, remember, used to belong to Al Andalus, meaning it used to belong to the Muslims. It was the Muslim extremity, which is probably important that they don't have any other thing on the map. If they were getting this information from the Europeans, why wouldn't they have England on there or anything like that? But instead, they have the extremities that go to the Muslim limits. But the Cape of Good Hope, of course, being an exception because it was not Muslim of and the land of Brazil, the Red Sea and the Sea of Persia, the Clove Island, the navigation of the Chinese and the Gores with their rums and direct routes followed by the ships and the hinterlands, and how the kingdom border on each other. It seems to me, sire, that this was the best thing I had ever seen, and that your highness would be very pleased to see it. It had the names of in Javanese writing, but I had with me a Javanese who could read and write. I send this piece to you, to your highness, with Francisco Rodriguez traced from the other, in which your highness can see where the Chinese and Gores come from, and the course your ships must take to the Clove Islands, and where the gold mines lie, and the island of Java and Banda of nutmeg and mace, and the land of the king of Siam, and also the end of the land of the navigation of the Chinese, the direction it takes, and how they navigate, how they do not navigate farther. The main chart was lost in the Frol de la Mar with the pilot and Pero de Alpine. I discussed the meaning of this chart in order that they could explain it to your highness. You can take the piece of the chart as a very accurate and ascertained thing because it is the very navigation by which they come and go. The archipelago of the islands called Salate, which lies between Java and Malacca, is missing. Now, so many important points made here that I had to skip over. So let's start to the very top. We're not going to read it, we're just going to translate it in modern speak. But you can see the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal, land of Brazil. We're talking about some real early stuff here. Probably one of the better clues for exactly why this native Japanese chart is important is because you can see there that at the bottom he says this is about where they come and go. And it also helped track certain places that the people of Europe, the Portuguese, wanted to conquer or to visit or to trade in those regions where previously they had no way of knowing how to travel to these regions. You can see that there's direction in these places. Now, it's important to note that there probably was Australia on this map. As, of course, we have discussed earlier, ships depicted in Australian caves that have the same formation that you would see in Java are all over Australian caves, which proves that the people of Java, long time ago, had knowledge of Australia. This is probably interesting because if you look at Albuquerque, he mentions a lot of islands and sort of kind of fails to mention Australia. This, again, would be great information because Australia was discovered in 1606 by the Europeans, meaning that the Europeans wouldn't have been able to discover it. But there are much more arguments that are made by some writers from Europe about why this map is what it is. Because, of course, you have people who then go, and it's probably a combination of Chinese maps mixed with um, Arab maps mixed with Portuguese maps. But the Portuguese maps or the Portuguese side of the maps have been questioned over and over again because of a lack of understanding of Portuguese roots that were used directly by the Portuguese in this map, but instead having routes as written here, written by the Chinese and all these other people of that region. Of course, the most interesting one is the Cape of Good Hope. One of the arguments used is that the Cape of Good Hope is an important site to the Portuguese. So, why would the Cape of Good Hope be listed there as an important region? Unless, of course, it was just important because it was copied from Portuguese maps and then sent to the other side. Now, the argument against this is that he only points it out because it's important to him, because there are several other places pointed out in the map of Africa. And of course, the Cape of Good Hope is not the most important place in Portuguese history. It was just one of the most impressive because it's one of the first where they discovered the lowest part of Africa. But of course, the Swahili coast was important to the Portuguese. Now, I know what you all are thinking. Isn't it convenient that it was lost to the seas? And Albuquerque states that, oh, yeah, it was lost to the seas. Well, even though the original was lost to the seas, the copy made in the 1500s, early 1500s, which also depicts that these people of Indonesia had a direct route to Japan, according to Rodriguez, who wrote down a copy of the map, as you will see. This is a small piece of the chart which is copied by Rodriguez, and as we will see, it will be explained. This is part of the government archives, so I hope they don't come down my throat. But this is part of the government archives that shows Rodriguez in the 15th century talking about and writing, and of course, we'll make a longer video about this. So I want us to remember where we started with this whole story. 1100s, Kilwa arrives in Indonesia. Indonesia has somewhat always been aware of the Polynesians' travels and even the Australian Austronesians. The connection between the two is the Papua New Guineans, but the Papua New Guineans and the Austronesians are sort of put together like an arrow between the Austronesians, Indonesians, Polynesians, and then the Americans. And so this might have been a long route as opposed to what we think today. If the Mongols had won, it is possible that the Mongols would have discovered this route and they would have made their way to the Americas, which would have been a complete flip of history. But of course, I like to defer to the experts, and the experts say the arrival of Vasco da Gama's fleet at Calicut in west coast of India in 1498, helped by Muslim pilots, experienced the Indian Ocean routes and trade, and primarily his safe maritime return to Portugal the following year, opened the gates to the virtually unknown Asian world for the Portuguese. Before 1498, little was known in the Portuguese about the remote East as per represented between frictions and scant reality in travelers' late medieval accounts, such as Marco Polo's or John D. Mandeville's volumes, as well as through the Italian Renaissance curiosity about the Orient, fueled by several intellectual refugees from Constantinople. Much more real and profitable were the experienced expensive Asian spices reaching European markets through Turkey and Egypt and distributed among rich courts, aristocrats, high burgesses, or even monasteries by the intermediation of the Italian trade towns largely headed by Venice. The maritime exploration of the extensive Asian seas and key trade points was extremely rapid in 1503. Portuguese ships identified the mouth of the Red Sea 3 years later. They reached Ceylon in 1509. They cast anchors in Malacca, strategic commercial city which would be conquered 2 years later in 1511 under the command of the governor Alfonso de Albuquerque. In 1512, expeditions were sent to the Maluku Island and eastern Indonesia reaching Banda this same year, witnessed the first Portuguese embassies to Siam and Pegu in 1513. A Portuguese fleet reached the south coast of China, commanded by Jorge Alvarez in 1515. The first Portuguese traders arrived in Timor, and in 1516, the banks of Bangala Gulf were explored only 18 years after Vasco da Gama's famous voyage to Hindustan. Portuguese captains, pilots, traders, and humble sailors or soldiers established contact with the most important commercial Asian maritime regions, identifying established old trade networks connecting for centuries South China, Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The speed with which this initial survey was carried out must be explained by the Portuguese systematic strategy from the very start to the resort to local alliances, pilots, sailors, travel traders. This process is perfectly witnessed by two major manuscripts, works organized immediately in the aftermath of the Portuguese conquest of Malacca, the Suma Oriental by Tomé Pires, and the unfinished book and atlas prepared by the pilot Francisco Rodriguez, both dating from the period between 1511 and 1515. Strangely enough, the two documents were presented in the same manuscript volume, now in the library of the French National Assembly in Paris, and were widely unknown in Portugal, where Piri's volume was preserved through a fragmentary Lisbon manuscript copy, while Rodriguez's book and maps were ignored. An account hand written by Francisco Rodriguez in his book and atlas in fiction, in fact, an incomplete and mixed book of seamanship, occupies the initial 116 folios of a codex instituted by a total of 178 folios, in which the last 62 folios offer the most complete copy of the Summa Oriental, an important epochal survey of Asian societies and economies written by the Portuguese apothecary and ambassador to China, Tome Pires, Francisco de Rodriguez book, as it is simply known, and catalogued present nautical rules, rudders, 26 maps, and 69 unique sketches of panoramic views of the island from Aller to Java. Unfortunately, 24 of these panoramic drawings are unfinished, only displaying summary outlines of beaches and mountains, mainly from the northwest coast of Java and adjacent islands. It seems clear that these sketches and brief written legends came from previous drawings, notes made during the slow journey along the chain of the islands of the Lesser Sandis archipelago, when Rodriguez returned to Malacca after the maritime expeditions to the Moluccas in 1512, in which he was one of the three Portuguese pilots among several others recruited locally. A traditional thesis recently repeated suggests that the manuscript was still in revision by his author between 1514 and 1515 in Cochin, to be then dispatched unfinished to the agitated court of King Manuel, which anxiously awaited news, maps, and rudders definitively revealing the precious routes towards the extremely fertile and much talked of eastern Spice Islands, whose identification should be controlled by the Portuguese monarch under the famous 1504 rules of secrecy on the new cartographic discoveries. There is no documental or logical evidence. In fact, the direct information of the 69 panoramic view of the eastern Indonesian islands from Alor to Java was not inserted in Rodriguez's chart of the same places clearly copied from local, probably Javanese and Chinese trade maps. At the same time, maps and drawings of our pilot did not influence the following Portuguese chart of the Malay Indonesian archipelago and the South China Seas, which still displayed huge cartographic misunderstandings for the next 4 decades. Even the cartographic situation of Malacca itself is clearly wrong in Rodriguez's second-hand charts of Southeast Asia, something that could be revised by simple observation since the Portuguese captain of the 1511 to 1512 expedition to the Malaccas, Antonio de Abre, tried to return to Portugal. The information requested by the Portuguese king was received through participation of the voyage and not through Rodriguez's book and atlas. Probably our young pilot died or disappeared during his known participation of the 1519 disastrous Portuguese embassy to China led by Simão Perez de Andrade. Nevertheless, albeit the lack of the direct influences in the 16th century Portuguese cartography of the East, Francisco Rodriguez's book is a paradigm of the paramount appropriation of local knowledge. Asian cartography and maritime information, the rare historiography on Rodriguez's work stressed the importance of the new set of charts on Southeast Asia, but the manuscript was also a major document with the Portuguese first cartographic information on South China and its maritime itineraries. In fact, Rodriguez's manuscript displays the first Portuguese and European rudder of China, followed by 5 maps on the South China Seas, mainland and islands. The quest of China was an important political and commercial goal immediately after the Portuguese conquest of Malacca in 1511, and the very few documents referring to Francisco Rodriguez also credited him with the first attempts to identify the maritime routes towards the Middle Empire. Very little is known of Francisco Rodriguez's life, education, and epochal works other than the information springing from his own book. The most important document on the pilot and cartographer appear in the addendum to the letter from the governor Alfonso de Albuquerque to King Manuel, written Cochin on 1 April 1512. In this important official text, one finds the following astonishing remarks. In this first correspondence, I send you a long letter in which I inform you of all I have done since the departure of the ships of Duarte de Lemao and Gonçalo de Cerqueira until my return from Malacca to Cochin. It was started in Malacca and ended in Cochin, and it takes us back to where we were in the beginning. So I won't read this part because, of course, I read it earlier. This is the letter, and you can see here that even the person who shows a chart of South China Sea, the blah 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 thingy, trips to Japan, all of that, even though he shows it, in his very book is this letter to the king from Alfonso de Albuquerque. And remember, 1511, 1515 to 1515, that's when they first discover the important islands there. So it's impossible that this chart was influenced by the Portuguese. And as you can see here, what they're alleging is that the Portuguese borrowed their later charts from this person, and that only these charts would have been very important, but they were only discarded when they realized that a lot of it was inaccurate, and when they realized that observation is more important than relying on previous maps. So if we read on, it says the maps that Alfonso de Albuquerque refers to in this text were lost, but their cartographic information is partially represented in some of the charts Francisco Rodriguez drew in his book. In fact, the express reference to pilot and cartographer, "I send this piece to your highness," that Francisco Rodriguez traced from the other, in which your highness can truly see where the Chinese and Gores come from, and the course your ships must take to the Clove Islands, and where the gold mines lie, and the islands of Java and Banda, of Nutmeg and Maces, and the land of the King of Siam, and also the end of the navigation of the Chinese, the direction it takes, and how they do not navigate further, allows us to assume that other than the original of a Javanese pilot, Rodriguez made a Portuguese style cartographic copy aiming to facilitate the king's acknowledgement, and probably other copies were disseminated amongst Portuguese pilots engaged in the expedition of the Moluccas, since Albuquerque discussed it with Pero de El Piom, auditor and also captain of the ship Santa Catarina, on which Antonio de Abre embarked as first captain of the fleet which departed to discover the famous Spice Islands. Now, all of this information would be mundane if it wasn't for the fact that Alfonso de Albuquerque mentioned that the Cape of Good Hope and also Brazil was on there. Now, from the point of view of the Indonesians, the Cape of Good Hope, it was probably going to be more significant in terms of reach than the Americas. But to us, obviously, the Americas is more important because people pretend like there is no way other humans could have gotten to that region. Now, again, I will state the Polynesians arriving in America or the Americas arriving in the Polynesian areas for trade. That is a fact that has been stated over and over again. There's no argument about that anymore. So that I'm not saying that no one believes that. What I'm saying is the fact that the Indonesians show this in their map that early, surprising the Portuguese, is clearly something that should be taken as a giant thing. But probably more important, in my opinion, is the Cape of Good Hope, because there is no need outside of the Portuguese first moving to that area for us to believe that the Indonesians had any access to the Cape of Good Hope. Access to the Cape of Good Hope gives you access to Angola. Access to Angola gives you access to the Kingdom of Congo. Access to the Kingdom of Congo changes everything. If the Indonesians had any awareness of Bantu people prior to the Portuguese arriving there, that changes everything that we know. Now, of course, this is why I make a lot of videos about this specific time, because there's something going on in this specific time that is important, that needs to be talked about, that no one is talking about, that everybody is ignoring, and that is that this time prior to the Europeans getting there was one of great exploration. We've all heard about the Vikings traveling to America and all of that, and I think that was a great expedition, great time going on voyages and all of that. But it is nothing compared to what was going on the East. Nothing. Isn't even slightly comparable. And I want to remind you that this Indonesian map that shows the travels, it also shows the limits of the Chinese. And so it's not the Chinese that went to the Americas. But again, it gets more complicated than that. Remember the map that I showed you where the people of the Islamic world weren't even fully aware in mapping Africa as a total? While they weren't aware of how to map Africa as a total nation, we have this chart. This chart, by the way, this isn't the complete chart, it's just a small copy. This chart that depicts the entire trade route and all of that of the Indonesians, that shows the Cape of Good Hope when the Middle Easterners didn't even know that there was such a thing as a Cape of Good Hope, tells us that that route is unique. That Indonesian Madagascan route to Africa is unique. It's got nothing to do with the Middle Eastern people. And remember, they also mentioned that they had Javanese names, which I'm going to need to look into because there's some copy names that were left over and used by the Portuguese. But having these Portuguese names for having these uniquely Javanese names for places like Brazil and whatever could tell us a completely different story altogether. Anyway, thanks for watching and like, share, subscribe, and donate if you can. It doesn't have to be as much as others donate. You can do even the slightest. Uh, don't forget to share the video because I think this needs way more attention. And yeah, that video is done. Thank you.